So we've talked about the discrepancy in educational achievement right now. We've talked about the decline in real income. What are the consequences of all this? You talked about deaths of despair. What does adulthood look like for the non-affluent man in America?
Well, for a lot of them, it looks pretty grim. And the deaths of despair you just refer to are a really good symptom of that. That includes deaths from suicide, drug overdose, or alcohol-related illnesses. And men are at least 3 times higher risk for a death of despair than women.
Why is it just because we're uptight and always our brains are going too much? It can't be that different. What is it about our biology?
Well, I mean, suicide, and it's hard sometimes to tell. Drug overdoses, and suicide, they overlap a lot. There's this kind of sense of just checking out one way or the other. I mean, of course, the ultimate checking out is tragically in suicide, but even the other things we're talking about, like opioids, men account for 70% of opioid deaths. In Washington State, there are new numbers now. It's 3/4 of opioid deaths are from men, and those are also drugs of retreat. They're not drugs you take to go out partying. It's not MDMA to stay up all night. It's not cocaine to be more interesting at a dinner party. It's a drug of retreat. And in fact, one of the reasons the deaths are so high is because the men, they are mostly men, are alone. And so there's no one to resuscitate them. Whereas with other drugs, there's usually someone else around. And I think it speaks to this sense of redundancy. We just talked about fathers. And how actually many of them just feel like they don't matter as fathers anymore. Maybe they're struggling in the labor market. Maybe they don't have a job. What's their role? And I was very struck by a study by Fiona Shand and others, which I quote in the book, of suicide among men. And they looked at the words that men had used to describe themselves before their suicide or suicide attempt. And the 2 most commonly used words to describe themselves by those suicidal men were useless and worthless. And it seems to me quite obvious if you create a situation where people feel that society, maybe their family, community doesn't have any use for them, they don't have any worth, then I think it's not surprising that so many of them will end their lives in one way or another tragically. Whereas for women, once they become mothers especially, there's a very strong sense that they matter. If nothing else, they matter to their kids. They're also doing better in the labor market, so there's more employment opportunity, etc. And so there's just it turns out, and this is I think an important truth, although it's an unpopular one in some ways, is that males are a bit more fragile. Their role in society is more fragile. It's more socially constructed. It's easier for it to collapse under certain conditions. And for working class men especially, those conditions have really been against them for a few decades now. By definition, if you are a father, you are incredibly useful and you're incredibly needed. I think it's a human universal that we all need to feel needed. If you have kids, you're needed. But maybe even if you don't have your own kids, maybe you have nephews, maybe there are boys in your life, in your extended family, who can help from you. And if not in your own family, in your community. It's really striking to me how we just don't see that many men stepping into these new roles and getting status from them in the community, in churches, in scout groups, in community groups, boys and girls clubs, whatever it is. But the main message I would say is to a 40-year-old man is there are boys out there, either your own or in your family or in your community, who need you. There is this real fatherlessness, this malelessness in many of our communities. And I think that you have a huge opportunity, but also a responsibility as a man in modern society to help fill that gap and help these boys to recognize what it means to become a man.